The tyranny and delusions of the social justice movement. The people who have brought the plague are convinced they are merely fulfilling their historical duty. Czesław Miłosz. The source of all these evils was a thirst of power, from rapacious and ambitious passions. Such things will ever be, so long as human nature continues the same. Thucydides, The History of the Peloponnesus War. Civilizations die from suicide, not murder. Arnold J. Toynbee. The Approaching Abyss. The Revaluation of Values. Perhaps we should start this book off with a little good news. You'll need it. No, it's not you that's lost your mind. Although it might appear as though the world has gone mad, it has not. At least not entirely. Not yet. The bad news, and it is bad, is that an increasingly influential minority of ideological zealots has infiltrated positions of social, cultural, and political influence. A climate of fear is really spreading. The purge of suspect individuals continues daily. It's a sort of Stalinist light sort of purge, but it's having its effect. People are cancelled, careers are lost, reputations ruined. Self-censorship is not just a workplace requirement. A seemingly humane statement such as "all lives matter" made on social media can be the grounds for your professional undoing. There is something deeply dispiriting in having to deny basic facts of biology or to assent to propositions that are demonstrably ridiculous. It truly has become an Orwellian world of inverted meanings. Parody has become impossible. Convicted violent male felons, after solemnly declaring their sincere conversion to the female gender, are now being placed in women's prisons. How do prison officials decide which men are actually women cruelly trapped in the wrong body? Well, it's basically run on the honour system. Why would they lie? Have you heard the wonderful news? Cardi B's song WAP was designated Song of the Year by NPR. Wow, how inspiring for young women everywhere. You see, Cardi B is black and she's also a woman. In case you're slow, this means she's doubly oppressed. With two entirely imaginary but vitally important victim points, she's incapable of doing or saying anything objectionable. Her message deserves to be heard. This means you, as an ally or advocate for social justice, must absolutely love the song. Yes, celebrities as champions for female empowerment think this song is just wonderful. If you don't love it or think it might be reductive of female possibility, you are a racist or misogynist, likely both. In case you missed it, WAP is Cardi B's tender ode to her incredibly wet vagina. Just how wet could this thing be? Well, it is wet enough to inspire global adoration and acclaim. In fact, if you believe Cardi, it's so wet that she needs someone to trail around her with a mop and bucket. A delightful image, no doubt. Cardi's message to women everywhere? A wet vagina is the key to female agency and social mobility. Now, you would be hard-pressed to find a stronger fan of a well-hydrated vagina than me. I mean that in all sincerity. That said, is this really the message that we want young women to internalise? Should fathers everywhere be telling their daughters not to worry about those physics marks and focus their daughters' attention instead on ensuring that they keep the moisture gradient of their vaginas high? Really, honey, women don't need to worry about school. You can achieve anything you want. Just keep that money maker of yours wet. No, this is not intended as parody. Feminists really have waved the flag of female empowerment on behalf of this reductive message. Nor is the installation of tampon dispensers in male locker rooms a parody of social justice lunacy. Of course men can have periods. The female penis? Yes, of course a woman can have a penis. And if you're a little resistant to the idea of a romantic relationship with a woman so equipped, well, that's because you are a bigot. Black students demanding racially segregated dorms? Yes, they want to be segregated. No, silly, this time it isn't exclusionary or oppressive, it's empowering. Islam is a religion of peace. Just how many more times will you be expected to nod along an agreement? After how many more blood-soaked atrocities carried out in the name of Islam? Apologize for your white privilege. Yes, that's expected. Occasionally, Employer-mandated racial sensitivity training will require a letter of apology from you for the sin of being white. As a person of colour, perhaps you find it incredibly reductive and condescending that people insist on reading you as the personification of racial or colonial oppression. Perhaps you'd like nothing better than to be seen as the individual you are. Are you a business owner who, for the sake of appearing socially virtuous, felt compelled to join thousands of others in apologising for your part for perpetuating systemic racism? You're not a racist, never have been. As you scratch your head, where you're left wondering precisely how it is you're supposed to combat this imaginary oppression. Silence is violence. No, violence is violence. Am I alone in my concern that the Red Guards of this cry-bullying SJW army is attempting to erase a fundamental right of liberal democratic society, the freedom of conscience? Until yesterday, we in the West were protected from having to publicly violate our conscience and parrot the required ideological nonsense. We were free from the daily indignity of having to declare our love for Saddam, or our gratitude to the dear leader, or our undying faith in the Führer. Nor did we have to express our undying gratitude for living in a workers' paradise. We had the right to give voice to only those beliefs to which our conscience had assented. No one could force any profession of faith or political loyalty. This is changing. In today's environment, failing to voice your endorsement for whatever nonsense the social justice agenda decides is now true will result in an unrelenting campaign to bring you to your knees. You will be subjected to a withering and sustained assault on your character. Some perceived slight against the new enlightenment will be used to launch a campaign of moral re-education. Every effort will be undertaken to socially stigmatize and humiliate you. In the process, the HR complaint against you will result in your firing, or your business will be boycotted. Finally, your reputation will be in tatters. Don't take it personally. This is not about you. It is about teaching the rest of us the consequences for not bending the knee. If you've taken the time to pick up this book, chances are you're wondering what exactly is going on here. A militant army of fascists calling themselves Antifa roam the streets of American cities beating people they have arbitrarily declared to be fascists. Yes, more than a little ironic. They have set buildings aflame, turned businesses into rubble, and marched into otherwise quiet neighbourhoods in the wee dark hours of the morning. While shining bright flashlights into the homes of the terrified occupants, they scream, "Wake up, motherfucker, wake up." Yes, these latter-day brown shirts have the temerity to call themselves anti-fascists. All evidence to the contrary aside, they demand you to do the same. They also expect that you view them as agents of social good. You know, a little gratitude would be nice. Racists, demanding that you reduce the identity and dignity of each unique individual you meet to predefined racialized categories, now call themselves anti-racists. And yes, they seriously expect you to see them as anti-racist. How making everything about race is anti-racist takes some explaining. In this Orwellian world, uttering the obviously true statement that men are not women, although seemingly unimpeachable in its logical and scientific rigour, will cause your social death, you will be cancelled. There's also a good chance an anti-fascist will punch you in the face. Although we shall explore these and other recent social pathologies, it should be clear to you that one of the darkest forces of cultural regression is the social justice movement. The anti-racist movement, all rhetoric aside, is deeply racist. Antifa, its fraudulent name de guerre notwithstanding, is fascist, and Black Lives Matter doesn't give a flying fuck about actually saving black lives. I hope to demonstrate in the pages that follow the progressive movement as a whole is deeply regressive. For the want of courage. A good rule of thumb in the current environment is to adopt George Constanza's policy of doing the opposite. Yes, seriously, and yes, you should be concerned. The stakes couldn't be greater. Liberal democracy's most fundamental orienting and sustaining values are under serious and sustained assault. Our institutions, you know, the ones that have underwritten our freedom, security and prosperity, will not continue to stand in the absence of strong and enduring support. This means you will need to actually resist the creeping insanity. In what follows, I hope to provide you with a crisp understanding of the facts beneath the myths, lies and distortions. However, you will need more than just understanding. You will need courage. Unfortunately, To borrow Andrew Clavan's very amusing phrase, I'm not the Wizard of Oz, I just can't give you that. Hopefully, once you understand the stakes at play, finding courage won't be a problem. We are in nothing less than a social justice jihad. It is an ideological war. To win this war, we need to break the spell of silent acquiescence and the leveraged pledges of support. Alexander Solzhenitsyn, in his work The Gulag Archipelago, reflects on precisely how it was that he, a war veteran, ended up in the Gulag. Jordan Peterson, a more intelligent or humane human being you are unlikely to find, quite rightly points out the tremendous moral courage such critical self-reflection must have required. Rather than seeking to blame an unfair world, Solzhenitsyn asks what role he had in his personal catastrophe. He, unlike the ignorant masses, recognized the social lie as it was being spoken. He was not alone. Well before Stalin had arrogated complete power unto himself, people who knew better were acting as though the living lie was the truth. It was this acquiescence that allowed Stalin to become the totalitarian monster he became. Had people displayed just a little moral courage, called out the lie, millions of lives could have been spared. In our present context, our institutions and society are being condemned as racist and oppressive. In a shocking display of moral cowardice, politicians, corporate leaders and presidents of universities have all stood in line to bend the metaphorical knee. They just couldn't get to the front of the line fast enough. Perhaps like you, I had hoped that the growing outrages to reason, basic principles of civility and common sense would have served to waken the woke to just how far from the road to moral progress they have wandered. When would they realise they are militantly marching us all in the wrong direction? The opposite direction, actually. I was waiting for the moment when supporters would realise just how morally ugly this movement has made them. Time and again the pattern repeats itself. Once receiving the appropriate signal, the army of the virtuous will set upon their intended target like a pack of wild dogs. Lacking all empathy, they engage in pitiless, unrelenting campaigns of condemnation, destroying innocent lives as they go. As one of a countless number of possible examples, and by no means the most extreme, let's look at a recent story published in the New York Times. Or, as Andrew Clavan reminds us, the former newspaper, the New York Times. In a shocking display of moral blindness, it recently praised the Machiavellian plot of an online attacker. The attacker, a black youth, held a copy of a video in which a 15-year-old white girl happened to use the N-word. He held this incriminating video for 3 long festering years. Asked why he held the video all this time, he explains that he did so because he wanted to release it at the precise moment when it would inflict the most harm. Is this really what heroism has become? Could the situation be more unseemly? This truly is the moral equivalent of someone wiping snot on your clean white shirt. Just how poisonous has this young man's soul become? And what of the New York Times, that former newspaper? Have they no compassion? Well, what about this racist 15-year-old? Doesn't she need to be taught a lesson? If she's a racist, I have yet to see evidence of it. Wasn't the video an accurate representation of bigotry? No, not even close. The 15-year-old girl, emulating rap video language, used the N-word in a celebratory cheer in the context of her obtaining her learner's permit. I can drive N. Yes, that's it. That's the damaging evidence. Please note, no innocent black person was injured during the filming of this video, including our Machiavellian hero. He wasn't even there. In fact, no one was called the N-word. At any rate, this young man's scheme to vilify the young woman worked. The woman, who had been a varsity cheerleading captain, had applied to the University of Tennessee. She had dreamed of becoming part of its national championship cheerleading team. Imagine for a moment this young woman's joy. Not only was she accepted to the university, she won a spot on the cheerleading team. Yes, this is the moment our hero chose to drop the video. After the release of the video, the university dropped her from its cheerleading team. Of course, this wasn't good enough for the social justice zealots. Apparently, she hadn't suffered enough for her crime. Under pressure from concerned parties, the university later rescinded its acceptance letter. I cannot express how ugly this all is. And just who is this hero? Yes, I know this vicarious victim's name. I decline to share it. I think this sort of public shaming is the later day equivalent of a public witch burning. I would hope at some point this young man and those advocates for justice who played a part in this quiet little tragedy come to recognise the moral evil they played a part in perpetrating. I don't have high hopes in the prospect, however. One would have thought, after destroying people's reputations, businesses, or beating people in the street, some of these advocates for justice might feel the stirrings of regret. Sadly, they seem to experience no signs of remorse. How does one live with one's conscience after destroying a person's business, ruining his career, or viciously beating someone in the street? Only by maintaining an unwavering conviction in the virtue of the cause. The act justifies the belief. Paradoxical? Not in the least. It's textbook example of cognitive dissonance. Honestly confront your guilt for ruining someone's life and experience all the attendant shame, or take the less costly route and double down on the virtue of your cause. Well, wouldn't the demand that they assent to increasingly absurd propositions finally force them to acknowledge their mistakes? Undoubtedly, this has been true for a few former adherents. For the true believer, however, there is seemingly nothing she or he is not prepared to sacrifice in the furtherance of this holy war. For the sake of the utopian ideology, he is prepared to use violence, mendacity, and completely renounce their commitment to science, logic, and reason. And no, this is not me imputing to the movement gestures they have not explicitly made. It is now an article of SJW faith that science is nothing more than a Western hegemonic regime of truth. There are, don't you know, other valid forms of knowing. And what of the principles of logic, the force of reason? For the SJW, these too have no necessary epistemic privilege. Social justice as religion. Singly or by sect, the Puritans were ready to devour one another. What is the reasoning behind exclusion and persecution? The keener the individual conscience, the sharper is its judgment of human beliefs and behaviour, its own included. In proportion to its love of truth and hatred of sin, it develops suspicion of others' faith and morals. The smallest divergence from the absolute is grave error and wickedness. From there, it is a short step to declaring war on the misbelievers. Barzun, 2001, page 271. My use of the term jihad, a religious war, as should be growing apparent, is not accidental. If I am correct, the social justice movement can only be understood as a deeply religious phenomenon. It is the expression of deep yearning for transcendent meaning and purpose. Only when understood as a religious phenomenon can we account for its irrationality, intractability, and militant fervour. You know you're in the realm of faith when reason and persuasive argument have no purchase. This isn't about truth, it's about meaning. Facts and evidence are inert, dissenters are burned as witches. A religion? Yes, a religion. As implausible as it may first seem, a serious case can be made that just as human beings are genetically wired for the acquisition of language, human beings are wired for the acquisition of religious belief. A quick and ready distinction between culture and nature is the founded upon principle that if a human phenomenon is universal, it is natural. If a practice is an isolated phenomenon, it is cultural. As illustrative examples, let's look at language acquisition and sati, the socially compelled self-immolation of a widow on her husband's funeral pyre. Although languages are subject to variety, there is no human society where language is absent. It is a human universal. Contrary to the learning theory model, children don't acquire language through some socially contingent reinforcement schedule. The speed at which children acquire language and their innate ability to master the language of birth and form novel linguistic constructions presupposes some innate language acquisition module. Language is thus as natural to the human animal as bipedal locomotion. By way of contrast, let's look at sati. It was a practice thankfully localized to Hindu religious adherents in India. It was the required self-immolation of a widow on the funeral pyre of her deceased husband. On more than a few occasions, the reluctant widow was helped along by concerned relatives of the husband. It was a culturally contingent practice, hardly a human universal. If the practice spoke to some underlying human need, we would expect to see meaningful correlates cross-culturally. We do not. Need I add that sati was bad? Just as with language, we see tremendous variety in religious belief. Religion itself is, however, a human universal. Every human population ever studied is found to have the institution. In the grip of religious fervour, horrendous moral evils have been committed. What possible evolutionary advantage could religious belief possibly confer? For the vast expanse of our evolutionary history, human beings survived as hunter-gatherers. Contrary to romantic idealizations of primitive societies living in a world of peace and brotherly love, the world of the hunter-gatherer was a very violent one indeed. Nor was the main or most dangerous threat from a hungry lion. Throughout history, the main predator of man was man. Pinker, 2002, page 306. The following from Winston Churchill sums this up nicely. The history of the human race is war. Except for brief and precarious interludes, there has never been peace in the world. And long before history began, murderous strife was universal and unending. An abundance of research from history, anthropology to ethnography supports this dark vision. Given this evolutionary context, religion confers two very powerful and related benefits. First, religion is perhaps uniquely powerful in its ability to foster in-group loyalty and commitment. Religion acts as a brake on natural dispositions toward aggressive, zero/sum contests between coreligionists. Those familiar with evolutionary theory understand that altruism toward close kin, known as kin selection, is part of our basic suite of human emotions and natural dispositions. Kin selection needs no further explanation. It is a universal phenomenon amongst social animals. Simply put, in providing aid to close relatives, we further the selfish interests of our own genes. The puzzle is to account for peaceful, cooperative societies that extend beyond kinship relations. Notwithstanding the New Age varieties of boutique spiritual practices currently en vogue, religion is an inherently communal institution. It is a religious belief that places supervening authorities over individuals, tracking their actions and threatening divine sanction. Prior to courts of law and the police, there were ever watchful gods or spirits. Religious fellow-feeling creates fictive kin, turning otherwise selfish, self-interested neighbours into an extended family of sorts. The second related phenomenon is that in binding coreligionists together, the collective body of society is seen worthy of sacrifice and defence. Witness the outrage and hostility directed at those who would dare challenge the new progressive orthodoxy. They are subjected to militant outrage mobs that will be satisfied with nothing less than the complete social dismantlement of perceived heretics. As Jacques Barzun notes, religious persecution is a health measure that stops the spread of an infectious disease. All the more necessary that souls matter more than bodies. Persecution is a duty, as well as self-defense against a spiritual invasion. It is the domestic form of religious war. Barzun, 2001, page 272. Thus, the sad spectacle of politicians and corporations across America coerced into acknowledging the persistence of systemic racism. Religion in the natural environment fosters an all-important esprit de corps, in the absence of which each person would, from natural inclination, seek his own safety, regardless of the consequences for non-kin. In the earliest of primitive contests, lethal tribal violence, driven by competition for scarce resources, those communities bound by religious affiliation were undoubtedly superior to those communities bound simply by ties of convenience. No one willingly sacrifices his life for the sake of convenience. What could be less convenient than an early death? Under pressure of incessant group conflict, evolution would have strongly favoured the emergence of genetic dispositions for religious belief. Wade N., 2015, page 50. War was undoubtedly a strong evolutionary force in fostering the adaptation of a religious disposition. Although binding coreligionists, it necessarily fosters suspicion, often visceral hatred of out-group adherents. In evolution, as elsewhere, there are no free lunches. The virtues of fictive kin would not have come about without the threat and reality of tribal violence. Wade N., 2015, page 168. Understood as a religious phenomenon, we should no longer be taken aback by social justice tyranny. Need it be said, the religious fervour was present in the killing fields of Cambodia, Stalin's and Mao's workers' utopias, and Hitler's Germany. The replacement of traditional religious belief with virulent ideologies may suggest a deep and very concerning problem in the heart of the Western world. It may well be that atheism just doesn't scale. Self-consciousness and the recognition of own mortality compels us to confront, honesty or otherwise, the question of meaning. To live in never-ending insecurity, in fluctuation, and be unable to answer the basic questions with which the universe and the human world encircle us is hardly tolerable. Kawakowski, 1990, page 125. The human animal appears to have a strong innate disposition for religious behaviour. No doubt, figures such as Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, and the late Christopher Hitchens, the new atheists, have managed to live meaningful, ethical lives without recourse to religion or its secular substitutes. They may prove to be exceptional in their ability to find existential meaning in the absence of religious belief. The mass, fervent embrace of dangerous ideological substitutes for traditional religion may be a sign of dark times ahead as belief in Judeo-Christian traditions continues to recede. Leszek Kawakowski is surely correct about the fundamental role Christian belief played in shaping liberal democracy. A Christian inspiration may also be seen at the roots of the ideas upon which modern democracy was founded. Locke's God and the God of the American Declaration of Independence were not merely rhetorical flourishes. The theory of the inalienable rights of man was developed from the Christian idea of a person as an inexchangeable value. Kawakowski, 1990, page 29. Commitment signalling. As with all such societies of enthusiasm, this social justice religion requires socially expensive signals of commitment. Are you really one of us? Prove it. Honest signalling in evolutionary terms represents behaviours that are intrinsically expensive. Talk is cheap. Honest signals are those that aren't easily faked. Any man can proclaim his undying commitment to a beautiful woman. Just how many are willing to demonstrate their sincerity through actual expenditures of time and resources? For the young woman, an effective strategy for distinguishing the man who really is after her heart from those who simply want to sleep with her is simply to play the game out. She resists all the early and eager attempts to get her into bed. The man that is prepared to invest serious time and attention is the man that values her for her. All religions require socially visible signs of sincere enthusiasm. In the woke world, we of course have the new, ever-expanding lexicon. Words simply don't mean what they used to. It is not enough, however, simply to utter the appropriate phrases in the appropriate contexts. Manifest and unforgiving outrage is expected. These are expressions of religious fervour. No doubt, this sets off something of a fierce competition in virtue signalling, thus the feeding frenzy that characterises attacks on social media. Each attack becomes more pitiless and relentless than the last. Zealots will spend untold hours digging through years of celebrities' old social media posts in order to uncover evidence of some dated thought crime, as witnessed in the 2019 Kevin Hart Oscar scandal. After digging up some stale corpse, in this case some decades-old tweets, it is dragged out before the world amidst shrieks of outrage and manufactured horror. But wasn't it you that unearthed up the body? In the realm of ideas, the committed SJW knows they must give their immediate and committed assent to the latest liberating absurdities, such as the proposition that math is inherently racist. Why? Because it privileges whites and oppresses blacks. Only a racist could deny this obvious fact. Proof? Black students on average score lower in math. Yes, quite a mystery. Maybe math really is racist. What do we do with the results of studies comparing the average amount of time Chinese, white and black students spent watching TV and studying? You're supposed to ignore these findings. Just for fun, can you guess which group tended to study the most? Which spent the most time watching TV? Well, no surprises here, folks. Black students studied the least and watched the TV most. Chinese students were a mirror image on time spent on homework and TV watching. Whites took second place for both categories. Do I really need to tell you how these groups stacked up in terms of academic achievement? No, I think you can imagine that on your own. So, no, there's no shocking, counterintuitive results here. Could these findings help explain the relative black underperformance? Should we really be indicting math, science, or indeed the educational system itself as racist? Yes, this is really happening. The Oregon Department of Education is actively encouraging teachers to register for training in ethnomathematics. This where you learn that the search for the right answer is furthering white supremacy. Another manifestation of this alleged racism is requiring students to show their work. Educators are also disabused of the notion that mathematics is objective. What good could possibly come from such nonsense? Well, it is part of an attempt to improve equitable outcomes. That's right, rather than forcing failing black students to confront their lack of effort and actually improve their outcomes, it is mathematics that must take the blame. Teachers are confidentially informed that they need to challenge the ways that math is used to uphold capitalist, imperialist, and racist views. You know what else mathematics holds up? Suspension bridges and high-rise apartment buildings. As we shall see, the prevailing insanity amongst educators is hardly confined to Oregon schools. The pedagogical ideology is rapidly spreading under the banner of anti-racism. A question of meaning. Contrary to what you may have imagined, this social justice ideology didn't arise among the poor and allegedly disenfranchised. This is not a bottom-up phenomenon, a cry of rage from the truly oppressed. Although they cry, rather a lot, it's all highly manufactured. The strongest proponents of the oppression narrative have come from the most elite, privileged universities. From there, they colonize the media, the educational system, and corporate offices. Heather MacDonald is surely correct in pointing out that by any measure, this activist generation is the most pampered generation the world has ever produced. It is also the most narcissistic. This is a fact. Is this bad? Yes, it's bad. Narcissists feel little reluctance in lying or using power and manipulation to advance their agendas. Campbell, page 132. Remind you of anyone? Professors of psychology Jean Twenge and Keith Campbell studied the data. In their book, The Narcissism Epidemic, they discuss how it is that today's youth has become the most entitled, self-absorbed generation ever. And the rise in rates is accelerating. By 2006, 1 out of 4 college students agreed with the majority of the items on a standard measure of narcissistic traits. Campbell, 2009. And no, their conclusions weren't simply based on that one study. Numerous studies, often involving comparing survey results from students of the same age during different decades, demonstrates the steady rise in narcissism. In one such study, the results of a questionnaire examining empathy and perspective taking, taken in 1979, were compared to the results from students in 2009. Nearly 14,000 students in each cohort had been tested. Scores for the 2009 students had fallen precipitously. Campbell, 2009, page 102. Where did this particular epidemic start? Leftists? Of course leftists. Leftist educators in the 1970s were convinced that students, particularly girls, were suffering from an absolute crisis in self-esteem. This was deeply misguided from the beginning. Results of the study that set the whole movement off indicated that white boys and girls had self-esteems that were roughly equal, with a slight advantage to the white boys. Black girls, whose academic achievement was behind the white kids, had higher self-esteem than even the white boys. The black boys, with the poorest academic achievement, had the highest self-esteems. Baumeister, 2010, page 263. The actual findings of the study were seriously misrepresented to the public by advocates certain of the virtue of their cause. Advocates were convinced that the root cause of everything from teen pregnancy to crime was low self-esteem. The absence of evidence was no argument against the cause. It seemed so intuitively correct. The contrast between actual achievement of these groups and their subjective sense of self-worth suggests that their self-esteems were radically untethered to academic performance. We know that Asian students are amongst the highest performing of all students, but have the lowest self-esteem of any group. Clearly, cultivating underserved self-regard isn't the route to improving academic outcomes. And no, it didn't help resolve any of those other issues either. This doesn't suggest we should be fostering low self-esteem, but for any society to prosper, our sense of self-regard needs to be tightly correlated to our actual achievement. In normal circumstances, a person's sense of self-worth tracks performance. People praise you for actually doing something well, like winning. Used to be, you getting a trophy was contingent upon actually winning, not for just showing up. Yes, low self-esteem can be painful. This pain arises for a reason. It's there to tell you need to improve in some way. At any rate, the self-esteem movement, artificially boosting self-regard, has served to produce an entitled, self-important generation convinced of the importance of their unique personhood. Recall Twenge's discovery of the dramatic decline in empathy. Could this explain how it is that our warriors for social justice can so casually engage in their relentless, pitiless attacks? They will mercilessly attack anyone if so doing will allow them to appear virtuous. Can it be a mere coincidence that this generation, showered in positive affirmation and unconditional acceptance, has become a generation so certain of its own virtue and so obsessively absorbed in its own imagined oppression? Wrapped up in a cocoon of wealth, positive affirmation and privilege, they look upon a nation that promises them everything only to sneer at and condemn all they see. The serious study of history means nothing to them. They of course know that all history can be reduced to Western imperialism, colonialism, oppression. Did they miss the class on Genghis Khan? The Armenian genocide perpetuated by the very non-Western Ottoman Empire? The human sacrifice, cannibalism and slavery of the Aztecs? Chinese imperial expansionism? And yes, China had slavery. It did so at least 200 years before the birth of Christ. What about the Persian Empire and its slavery? Or the West African tribes from whom the Europeans bought their slaves? Our entitled zealots for social justice seem entirely ignorant of the invading Muslim armies from Asia, North Africa and the Middle East that harassed, tyrannized and subjugated Europeans for centuries. And yes, there was slavery. More than 1 million white European Christians were enslaved by North African Muslims between 1530 and 1780. In fact, Muslim pirates enslaved at least twice as many white Europeans than the colonies of the United States enslaved African blacks. Sowell, Intellectuals and Society, 2011, page 408. Whites continued to be traded in Muslim slave markets decades after American slaves had been emancipated. Sowell, Intellectuals and Society, 2011, page 480. In the age of Islamic expansion, Muslim armies brutally seized broad swathes of territory including the Middle East, Eastern Europe, Central Asia, India, Persia, North Africa, Egypt, Spain, and Sicily. As Islam advanced, it placed conquered Christians and Jews in a state of semi-slavery. Subject to humiliation, religious persecution, and punitive taxes, subjective peoples were coerced into converting to Islam. Compare the state of those countries that were rescued from Islamic tyranny to those that were not. Compare Spain to Syria or Portugal to Egypt. These conquered lands have long since ceased to be recognizable to their former selves. They are all similarly intolerant and repressive. For centuries, Egypt, Syria and North Africa had been very prosperous parts of the Christian world. In the wake of massacres, the burning of Christians alive, the sexual enslavement of women and children, these countries converted to Islam. Ibrahim, 2020, page 35. No compulsion in Islam? Think again. The local cultures were all radically displaced by a dominating Islam. How is it possible that a student can graduate from an Ivy League university with the impression that conquest, empire and slavery were sins unique to the West? To quote Theodore Dalrymple, paraphrasing in turn Dr. Johnson, such stupidity is not in nature. It has to be worked for or achieved. Dalrymple, Life at the Bottom, 2001, page 167. Universities have poisoned young, idealistic, impressionable minds with toxic nonsense. Postmodernism, multiculturalism, and the assorted grievance studies. In consequence, today's youth has become estranged from Western culture, unable to attach their identities to its legacy or view its accomplishments with pride. If relativism and postmodernism open the door to nihilism, social justice has provided an answer to the question of meaning, transcendent, anti-religious, religious meaning. For all the virtues of liberal democracy, it is altogether silent on one crucial feature of human existence, the question of meaning. This is not a bug, but a feature. In a liberal democracy, you are free, within reasonable limits, to pursue your own vision of the good. It is in fact this feature that permits people of disparate backgrounds and varied tribal affiliations to live together in peace. Individuals of whatever background, race or religion could live together under a set of shared principles. Around the world, tribal violence of various sorts is a daily reality. You are chained to your tribe whether you wish to be or not. A joke during the Troubles in Northern Ireland illustrates this point. An American is stopped by armed gunmen while travelling on a road late one night. The gunmen ask him if he's Catholic or Protestant. Dangerous. The American answers that he's an atheist. Okay, smart guy, a Catholic atheist or a Protestant atheist. Across the globe, you aren't free to decide your tribe. Regardless of your sympathies, others will judge you, for better or worse, in terms of an ascribed identity. Hutu or Tutsi, Shiite or Sunni, Muslim or Hindu. Your tribal identity is inescapable. In the United States, until yesterday, you were a free, self-defining agent. You got to decide what affiliations defined you. Even immutable features of your identity weren't determinative. So you're gay. This could be very salient for you, perhaps a matter of activist engagement. It needn't be. Nothing compelled you to make your sexual orientation the most interesting or compelling feature of your identity. The same was true if you're black. Nothing required you to make race the most salient feature of your life. In the United States, you are free to enter and freely leave religious, community, or social affiliations. Indeed, the various civil rights struggles were undertaken for precisely this right of previously excluded individuals to be treated just like everybody else, not judged, excluded, or marginalized due to accidental features of birth. Having won their right to be judged by the content of their character, not the colour of their skin, identity politics and the anti-racist ideology is again chaining people to their race, gender, sexual orientation. We are becoming socially splintered, tribalized. The patriotism that once gave people from disparate backgrounds a supervening sense of meaning is rapidly eroding. Growing numbers appear to be lost with respect to the basic question, meaning disabused of their commitment to the American dream and Western achievement. For the educated elite, traditional religious belief has become disreputable and consumerism simply doesn't provide an answer of sufficient existential gravitas. What great meaning can inspire their lives? To what heroic cause can they attach themselves? A mortgage and stable employment? Unlike their predecessors, leaving the humanities inspired and ennobled by the history, art and thought of the Western tradition, generations indoctrinated into the oppression narrative have been left estranged. Douglas Murray, in his book The Madness of Crowds, highly recommended, pointedly diagnoses the problem. People in wealthy Western democracies today could not simply remain the first people in recorded history to have absolutely no explanation for what we are doing here, and no story to give life purpose. Murray D., 2019, page 1. What of the American dream? It's nothing more than the dominant ideological formation, grounded in nothing more epistemically valid than power. Those possessed of this insight are like those in Plato's cave allegory who have ventured outside into the light. They see behind the myth for what it is. They have, in Thomas Sowell's words, the vision of the anointed. For the warrior for justice, postmodernist discourse is emancipatory. In contrast to you, they are no longer operating under a false consciousness. They are on the path of the truly righteous. They are the elect, certain they are on the side of history. Do they not see Nietzsche's will to power in their militancy? As Leszek Kołakowski reminds us, maintaining a degree of humility in our own supposed virtue can be critical in preventing totalitarian horrors. It is important for us to be uncertain about the deep motives for our own deeds and the grounds of our convictions, since this is the only device that protects us against an all-justifying fanaticism and intolerance. Kołakowski, 1990, page 83. If the goal is a perfected future, a future without racism, want or exclusion, no cost is too great. Of course, anyone who would oppose the cause of social justice is, by definition, a Nazi. What aren't you permitted to do against them? Look at what Nazis are capable of. Clearly, no tactic is off the table.